Kurt Weiler, senior writer with the Osceola on the Rivals Network, is our special guest. It's time for a Florida State football preview. This is ACC Nation. I'm Jim Quist. That's Will Ogenin if you're watching us on YouTube. Welcome, Kurt. We appreciate you joining us.
It's good to be here. Good to be mere days away from the start of college football season.
Yeah, man. Antsy. It's coming. Hey, got to tell you, saw you on the ACC network on ACC PM this afternoon. You're looking good, and you fit right in. So I think it'll only be a matter of a few days before the ratings come in and they say, I think this guy needs to take Packers' place. So
anyway. hey. He's still got some years left. Come on now.
Not starting any rumors or anything. Hey, can we say that there's a wee bit of enthusiasm building around this year's version of Mike Norvell's Seminoles?
Yeah, I think that is a good way of saying it. I think most fans understood what he inherited, and they've been patient. And I think now they're kind of like, okay, let's see. I think the team is starting to look like it should again. I think especially the top end of the roster is starting to look like it closer to what it should again. Not maybe back to the heyday yet, but it's looking more the part. And so, yes, I think there is a real enthusiasm entering a pretty important year for Mike Norvell.
Yeah, year three, the all important. Well, that's this year three thing needs to be tossed by the wayside, especially since we dealt with COVID and all the other stuff. We need to be a little more realistic and look at maybe five, depending on how things go. I'm just throwing that out there because I think that's probably what needs to be done here too. This year's schedule, Kurt, really doesn't do the team any favors. But here's something that I'm looking for: how they perform in New Orleans against LSU. If they pull off a win there, it's going to really alter the perception of this team outside of Tallahassee, because a lot of people right now are just sort of like, I'm not really sure. This is a team we need to keep an eye on, blah, blah, blah. But if they beat LSU, yeah, there's going to be a lot of chatter. So before we get into that full-blown schedule, let's take a look at this one game. Tell us what your thoughts are on how important it is. I'm skipping over the first game, okay? But tell us how important that LSU game is going to be in New Orleans.
I mean, it's undeniably, like you talked about. I mean, it would be the type of win. Obviously, I think Florida State's a slight underdog in the neighborhood of like 3 points. I think the common perception is it should be a game, even though it's essentially a road game there in New Orleans. I know there's the turnaround game in Orlando next year. The two are going to play again. I mean, LSU, this LSU team. I mean, when you look at how they fell off pretty recently from a title to Ken Orgeron being fired in less than 2 years' time, I mean, it was obviously pretty remarkable. But at the same time, I think there remains a decent amount of talent on that team. I mean, it's not a team that's about to probably contend for a national title, but it's still a team. I mean, Ed Orgeron recruited at a high level, and it will be a challenge. But, I mean, it is definitely the type of win Florida State hasn't had in a while. I mean, the North Carolina wins have probably been the trademark wins the last 2 years, and then maybe the Miami win last year as well. And all of those, I mean, those three were all in their own ways impressive. There were probably wins that spoke to Mike Norvell's coaching ability and how that things were in some areas maybe ahead of where we thought they would be. But this would be a bigger win than all those, the biggest win that I can think of in quite a while. Just, I mean, from a program, just in terms of, I mean, you talked about the LSU brand, it would be a major step back for the Florida State brand.
People have heard me talk about this a lot in the past. I'll reiterate it. I actually have 3 sister-in-laws who are LSU grads, a brother-in-law who follows LSU. So I kind of hear that in my ear. Well, in my brain, it's an echo chamber a lot because we're ACC. So for me, if Florida State pulls off a win here, this is huge. And you know who I'm going to be rooting for, diehard Noel fan on that day. I'm going to be looking for it. But I'll tell you, one of the things, and not to totally disparage anybody who came out of South Bend, but I really think it's not about the talent so much in Baton Rouge. I think it's about the coach. I'm just going to make that point. And at at this moment, maybe I should just let that lay, because I feel like I'm going to get off on some sort of soapbox and go crazy. But let's let Will get into talking about some about what's going on with the offense and defense with you, Kurt.
Now I'm looking forward to hearing Brian Kelly's best Cajun accent on that during that game. But let's be real. The offense, it had its moments last year, but I think it's not far fetched to say that this team turned the ball over way too much last year. I think only Duke had as many turnovers with them as ACC. What do they have to do to knock that number down?
Well, I think the biggest thing when you look at it, obviously, I mean, yeah, that was a problem for them. I think a big part of it was what they were operating with from a standpoint of an offensive line, where I think they had a, I'm not even going to say okay, but I think a step in the right direction, starting five on the offensive line last year. But really, when they lost a player, and they did lose a couple over the course of the year for periods of time, the depth was not where it needed to be that yet. And then when you look at the wide receiver room, I mean, it's nothing against the room that Mike Norvell inherited. I don't mean any personal offense, but I think they're not, definitely the receiver room hasn't been up to the Florida State level by any means. And when you look at the fact that Mike Norvell hasn't yet had a 400-yard receiver in a season here, that's not a him problem. When you look at his track record, that's a state of the roster problem. And I think they addressed both those. And I think that's the big thing. I think we'll get into them, I'm sure, more specifically. But the receiver room and the offensive line room, I think both should be better. And that should help everything up. It should help Jordan Travis be more confident and be more capable. And I mean, I think it only can help the run game, which has been a strength, even when there were questions about the pass game, be even more of a strength.
You mentioned Jordan Travis, and I think just for watching the eye test, I felt he was a much better passer, especially at the end of the season. Last season, only had a 3-touchdown game against Boston College. But there's still another level to unlock with him as a passer.
And so, I mean, I think the biggest thing is there have been other options the last two seasons, and I guess other options still exist. But I mean, this is Jordan's job. There's been no doubt he's the starter all off season, despite some impressive moments from some reserve quarterbacks on the roster. And I think that has benefited him. I think the biggest thing is he hasn't yet kind of made it through an entire season. He's kind of dealt with the injury things. I think some of that is a factor of just the type of quarterback he is. I mean, with the guys who move that much, who sometimes take the hits, that can be a problem they have to deal with and have to learn how to kind of be as safe as possible. And I think Jordan's come a long way. I think Jordan's also come a decent bit as a pocket passer. I mean, you talked about his passing ability, and I think he's gained confidence there, and I think that's carried over. But I think he's even kind of wants to prove this season, like, hey, I can be a pocket passer. I'm not just like a one-trick pony who relies on my legs. And I think we've seen that from what we've gotten to see of the of preseason camp.
Do you still see the running back still being a pretty big part of the passing game? I know they threw the backs a lot.
Yes, I do. I mean, yeah, that's kind of a micro. He wants to use those running backs in a lot of different ways. I mean, they're going to be a big part of everything. I think the receiver room I do feel much better about, but I still think when you look at that trio they have of, it's going to be a lot of Trey Benson from Oregon transfer, a lot of Lawrence Toafili, and a lot of Trayshawn Ward. I think that unit's still going to be a big anchor for this team, really across the board.
Yeah, Micah Pittman is one of the receivers who looks to be a starter, another Oregon transfer. I noticed that the other wide receivers on the depth chart are listed as oars, and especially with Ontario Wilson, who was one of the leading receivers. Is that kind of sending a message there, or is this kind of playing little mind games or something like that?
It's a few things. I think it's they want to kind of see how they perform in a real game before like locking in that depth chart. Some of that you see early in the season. I think it also speaks to the number of receivers they're going to use. I mean, Mike Norvell just today after practice talked about, I mean, he could see anywhere between 7 and 9 receivers seeing plenty of playing time this year. I think that room is infinitely better. You talked about Micah Pittman. Johnny Wilson has been a pretty important addition to that room as a guy who doesn't really look like anyone else in that room. He's 6'7" and moves well at the side. He's not like a tight end in how he moves, and he's going to be, I think, a real red zone threat for them. I mean, he's been pretty lethal in the preseason there. And even a guy in Deuce Spann, who's also on the depth chart, was converted quarterback originally from, I think, the Tampa area. And he was really raw in the spring because I think he was at Illinois before and only spent 1 year at receiver last year. And we kind of were like, oh, well, probably not this year, maybe next year, we'll see. And he has come along so far this summer where he's going to play a lot, and his speed can be really lethal. I mean, he can take the top of the off of the defense and make them respect everything far more than anyone else in that room. So I think it's more just they're going to play plenty of guys, but they also, I think they want to kind of reward the guys who showed out this preseason with those kind of or distinctions.
So the best laid plans of the offensive line kind of went awry when transfer Caden Lyles was injured and is going to miss the whole season. So now, according to the depth chart, they're going to bring in Darius Washington, who played both guard spots last season, to play center. Looks like the left side of the line looks pretty good, but the right side is a bit of a question mark. How do you see the right side of the line kind of filling out as we go into game one here?
Yeah, so it bears mentioning, Caden kind of like was fighting for the starting job there, but also with Maurice Smith, who he's also going to miss this weekend's game. His injury's not as bad. They're expecting him back at some point in the near future, and I think he'll end up being the starting center. Darius, though, I mean, Darius is a guy who's really played all 5 spots throughout his career. It's a pretty rare distinction where a guy can play center, guard, and tackle, and has played each of those spots in games at FSU. Yeah, the left spot's definitely an anchor. I mean, Robert Scott and Dylan Gibbons are both returning starters there. I think Robert Scott's a guy who some draft experts kind of have as maybe a guy who's gone after 3 years if he has a good year and stays healthy this year. And Dylan Gibbons is that veteran, the Notre Dame transfer. The right side's interesting. Bless Harris, who's I guess listed as a starting right tackle. I didn't know what to make of him coming in. He was a Lamar transfer. You don't really know, especially offensive line wise, how are guys going to handle kind of the FCS to FBS jump. I mean, could be significant for some people, and he's handled it no problem, and he's been really impressive. And I had won that job honestly a while ago, in my opinion. And then at right guard, I mean, you got 2 summer enrollee transfers. A lot of the transfers were here in January. Those 2, Dimitri Emanuel and Justin Turnantine, both arrived over the summer, and they both bring a great deal of experience. Emmanuel actually was briefly coached by Alex Atkins, the offensive line coach now at Charlotte, before Alex came here. And yeah, I mean, Emmanuel, I've been impressed with how he's hit the ground running, and I would project he's probably going to be the starter there. Turntine is a South Carolina transfer who FSU kind of was in on very late and was a very late addition. And he's an interesting guy where he's played, honestly, a lot of left tackle at South Carolina. He's never really played guard. I think he's a guy who may be the first guy up at quite a few spots just from what he brings to the table. He's pretty versatile, and he's been pretty impressive with how quickly he's picked things up at a few different spots.
So, Kurt, I've heard the term matured used and applied to this offensive line. Do you think that's accurate?
Yeah. I mean, it's a mix of, they played a number of young guys. I mean, Robert Scott is a third-year player I couldn't tell you how many games he started offhand, but I want to say it's the better part of 15. Like, he has played a lot and then Darius Washington, similar. Maurice Smith, who is going to come back, is similar. Dylan Gibbons is similar. And so you have guys who kind of grown up and matured, I would say, in the system. And they've also really injected on the offensive line with those transfer additions, with Lyles, who may not be playing this year. I think it's possible he's going to explore getting, I think, what would be a 7th year of eligibility, kind of the medical redshirt, and may come back. But he's still very involved, and you see him talking up guys. He's out at practice a decent amount. And ditto the guys who they're going to have available from those transfers, and they have a great deal of starting experience elsewhere. And so I think it's a mix of, there's been the maturation of the kind of the guys who kind of the trial by fired here, and the kind of injection of experience that the transfer portal can provide.
So this sounds to me like they're going to give Travis a little bit more time this year to make things happen offensively. Would you agree with that?
I would. I mean, LSU will be a tough test on that right off the bat. I think that is going to be a very good defensive line. I think they have a defensive tackle who might be like all SEC. He's that good. So yes, but no, on the whole, absolutely. I think this offensive line, I'm not going to go so far as to say I think they're going to be a good offensive line, but I think for the first time in a while, Florida State may have an average offensive line, which from what it was in the last few years would be a major step in the right direction.
That's a step up, and that's in the right direction. Hey, I'm going to take you completely off track here. We're going to talk about sports, but it's going to be something a little different. So and then we'll get into the defense. Athletic director Michael Alford is putting a different spin on things with Florida State financially rewarding student athletes for good grades. Talk to us a little bit about what this is about, what this concept is about, and what your thoughts are.
So yeah, Florida State's not the first one in the ACC on this. This was kind of brought to my attention, I think, in April. I'd forgotten about it. I think it's been in effect for 2 years, and that schools can, but schools kind of wanted to wait to see how the NCAA versus Alston ruling came down last summer. That kind of paved the way, and that was, I think, a case. I don't remember offhand what school he played for, but it was a football player, a former football player, who kind of argued, hey, that it like the we should be like, if students can like earn scholarships for good grades or things like that, why should we not be eligible similarly, especially with how busy our lives are? And yeah, I think from looking at the list, I think from an ESPN story that I used to kind of find back in April, I think it was Clemson, North Carolina, and Miami were kind of the first schools in the conference to adapt. And so it just came up in an interview yesterday. The full interviews on our website on the Osceola with Michael Alford, but just came up of asking like, hey, is that something Florida State's going to start doing? And this is his first full year as AD. He started the job in January, and it's something that he said, I don't have the details yet. That may be something he has to kind of get cleared with the higher ups of what the threshold is, or how much up to the nearly $6,000 a year they're going to give out, because I know that's up to their discretion. But no, I mean, I'm all for it, because I mean, I'm always very impressed with the student athletes who you regularly see on the dean's list, on the Seminole Scholar, I think is what they are, and just like, because I know how busy their schedules are, so the ones who take the time to do that well in the classroom, it's very commendable.
Interesting. I thought I would bring that up because I did see this on your site, and I thought this is a good read. It's something I think that if you're a Seminoles fan, you really ought to be checking out the Osceola for this article and getting a little better feel for what's going on behind the scenes and why it's going to be beneficial to student athletes. Hey, Will, let's get into talking with Kurt a little bit about the defense now.
Yeah, I'd say there's just a little bit of a gap to fill here. When you lose a guy like Jermaine Johnson, who pretty much wreaked havoc on every backfield in the league last season that was on the schedule, he's now gone. Obviously, a first-round pick, but there's been a lot of hype around Jared Verse, who came in from Albany after a 9.5 sack season, I believe, as a freshman at Albany, and like I said, there's been a lot of hype around him. You get Dennis Briggs back. He missed a lot of last season with an injury, and you get a couple of starters back. But it feels like that even though there isn't that big name like Jermaine, there's still like a pretty solid defensive line.
Yeah, I think as to where last year it definitely started with the ends, which I think a lot of times you do see on the defensive line. I think it's going to start with the tackles this year. I mean, when you bring back two fifth-year guys and Fabian Lovett and Robert Cooper, I mean, those two have played a lot of college football, and they didn't have to come back this year. I think they kind of came back. I mean, they could stand to probably bolster their draft stock. And I think they want to kind of leave Florida State in a better spot. I mean, I think both of them. Cooper has been here. I mean, 2018 was his first season, so he's been here through all of Willie Taggart. He committed to Jimbo and is now entering year 3 of Mike Norvell. Fabian, I think, is entering year 3 here, but they've both been very disruptive this preseason, and even the depth behind them. I mean, Josh Farmer's a local kid who he's pretty quickly transformed his body, and I think is going to make a big impact there. But yeah, I think the ends too. I mean, I hesitate to talk about, and I kind of try and pump the brakes with our readers on the boards just about the Jared Verse to Jermaine Johnson comparison, because Jared Verse is an athletic freak who's going to make a lot of plays. I think he could make quite the debut Saturday against Duquesne. I wouldn't be surprised, but I do not think he's going to be the ACC Defensive Player of the Year. I think it's a tough bar to reach. The nice thing is, I don't think he has to do that by himself. I think you talked about, I mean, I think if he and Dennis Briggs and Derek McClendon, who's kind of has waited his turn and is going to be, I think, a starter this year or in that main rotation. And I think it's about kind of the group of guys trying to come close to matching that. And I think if they do, the defense as a whole is going to be pretty good, because I think that's the biggest, like, if I had a question, defensive end would be the biggest question, but they return almost everything else from last year, and they add quite a few pieces through the portal.
Right. And then, they run a 4-2-5, but both of these linebackers, I think are really good. This is probably the strength to me of this defense, with Kalen DeLoach back and Tatum Bethune, who they got out of the portal, who's been a starter, at UCF. I think he had over 100 tackles last year. Feels like this is a really strong linebacker unit, even depth wise too.
Yeah, on the two deep wise, I'd say the problem is outside of those four on the two deep,
Mhm.
there are some questions about if an injury happened, it would make things a little tougher. But you're right. I think the top four, absolutely. I mean, Tatum Bethune has been everything FSU wanted him to be when they brought him in. Got great instincts as a linebacker, is constantly in the backfield stopping plays sideline to sideline, is good in coverage, does everything, and it is going to be exactly what FSU thought it was getting, and then some. Kalen DeLoach, I mean, last year you really saw. I think in 2020 they tried to play him more. He wasn't quite ready. It's guys you don't know kind of the pace they're at. Last year he really grew tremendously over the course of the season. By the end of the year, I mean that safety he had against Boston College just spoke to how far he's come. And DJ Lundy's a guy he's lost a lot of weight this offseason. And for whatever reason, that has fixed his biggest problem, which he was kind of at times a liability in coverage. And that doesn't seem to be the case anymore. And I think if he's fixed that, he's another great third linebacker to have. And then even Amari Gaynor, who's another fifth-year senior, has kind of been around the block and is back and going to be a nice veteran presence. I think you feel really good about that top four.
Feels like the corners are a bit of a question mark. There's not a ton of starting experience of what's there, but the safeties are really good. I know Jamie Robinson led the team in tackles last year, and sometimes that's good, sometimes that's bad. But I feel like this is good. Akeem Dent as well had a really nice season. Those are, they say, two veterans of this safeties. It feels like that at least early on they may have to do a little bit more until the rest of the secondary gets its feet wet, I guess you could say.
Yes and no. I think Duke Cooper at cornerback was a guy who really came on strong down the stretch of last season. I know he had a pick, I think, against Miami and a few other games. He was a guy as a true freshman who was hurt in preseason, and kind of that slowed him down. But by the end of the year, he was that guy for them, and so I think he will be a solid corner option for them. But yeah, I mean that safety combo. I know Jamie and Akeem very much enjoy playing next to each other. They were quite impactful. Jamie was another guy who didn't have to come back but did, and I think had multiple reasons for doing so, and I think is poised to have another. I mean, I think he was a second team preseason All American. He's a guy who does it all. I think had quite a few tackles last year. I think was tied for the ACC lead in interceptions. And Akeem is a former 5-star recruit who kind of finally found his spot. It took him a little time, but yeah, down the stretch last year, he was a great complementary piece, and I do think they'll be an anchor in the back of the defense.
Let me back up for just a second here. Linebackers, and you talk about depth. Didn't feel like depth was a question, but how does Dix being out for the season impact that?
Yeah, I mean, what I'll say is, I think with what I've seen from a few other guys they have there, it's not as bad as I would have thought. Like he's a guy coming into the preseason, I thought may have been the fifth guy, may have been kind of the next guy up beyond those four, Steven Dix. But the freshman Omar Graham's impressed me enough, and even Brendan Gant, who's a converted safety, have impressed me enough where I think those guys will be okay. I don't know if they're ready for kind of how big a role they are ready for. But I think they'll be okay. I mean, you don't want to lose depth. It's not an incredibly deep position like some other spots on the roster, but it is. I mean, injuries are going to happen. Nobody wants them to, but they are. That's not a horrible loss by any means in the scheme of things.
Okay, not to downplay Dix, but just to say
Yeah,
that
of course.
depth
Yeah.
wise, right? Okay, I got you. Um, just covering all our bases there. Let's talk about special teams here real quickly. Kicking, the kicking game, field goals, punting, returns. What are we looking at here?
Yeah, so they bring back, I guess now, guys entering their third year as kickers or as kicker and punter, the specialists in Ryan Fitzgerald and Alex Mastromano. Ryan Fitzgerald had a pretty good, in fact, I would say very good step forward in his 2021 season. When you look at the numbers, he was kind of the sole kicker after he split time in 2020. I think that suited him well.
Mm-hmm.
Alex Mastromano is the latest in kind of the growing Australian punter trend, and he's impressive in that. I mean, I've said this before. I don't think I'm jinxing him by saying this. He had a touchback on a punt in his first career game against Georgia Tech in 2020, and hasn't had one since. And he's handled all their punts. He's gone, I think, was that 20 games without a touchback. So I mean, he's for a team that is going to be in probably a lot of close games. I think it's an asset to have a guy who can do that, and he's interesting. He can punt with both feet. He can roll out to either side, which I think helps with some of the directional stuff. When you talk about returners, that's obviously been a problem for FSU. I mean, they had troubles last year. They lost so much in hidden yardage just with returners not able to catch punts or kick returners making bad decisions of bringing it out or not bringing it out. And I think that group's going to be a lot of transfers. I think understandably for you may not see the guys who were out there last year. I think Deuce Spann, who I talked about, the receivers, it could be a real asset in the kick return. And I think Micah Pittman is probably going to be their punt returner. And I know he did that a decent amount at Oregon and did it pretty well. So
I'll have to wait until see what happens with Duquesne. Let's talk about our schedule, and Will and I can kind of go back and forth a little bit on this one. We'll talk a little bit about the Duquesne game. I don't even is there even a spread out there for this game? Because
I don't think there is.
I haven't found it.
I feel like you normally see those as the season goes on for FCS, but I think people don't want to put spreads when they don't know. For an FCS week 0 game, they don't want to put a spread on. I have not seen one.
Yeah, not. I think we can notch that as a win. Just
I would agree.
Sorry, Duquesne fans. This LSU game, we'll get back to this again because this is a critical game, and I know that as you pointed out, it's what LSU is a 3.5 point favorite at this point, something along those lines.
I think it's 3 or 3.5, somewhere in that neighborhood. Yes,
I think it'll get a lot closer as the game comes up on us because it typically does. But what do you see as the potential for Florida State, and what do they have to do to win? In other words, in this game against LSU.
I think a big thing is, I mean, we talked about the defensive line, and I think LSU is going to have 5 new starters on the offensive line. I mean, that's a pretty big deal, and so I think disrupting them with a new quarterback in there too. It seems like it's going to be Jaden Daniels. I mean, a problem for Florida State at times has been less of a problem down the stretch of last season was getting off the field on third downs. I mean, that's obviously going to be big. And I mean, you talked about turnovers. I mean, obviously that always feels like a big one, but I would also say maximizing your scoring opportunities. I mean, when you look at FSU, I think they come into this year the longest active streaks in the country, both in interception, 8 straight games with interception, which I think obviously would be big, and 32 straight red zone trips that have ended in points. I think those streaks continuing, supposing they do this weekend, continuing there would be significant on both fronts.
One of the things I do not like on this schedule is an open date September 10th. I think that's horrible.
They get 2 because they're playing a week 0 game.
Okay.
They have another one in October.
True. Okay.
Yeah, if that were the only one, I would agree with you. But I don't think they'll mind it a chance to. I mean, especially whether that is a big win over LSU or a tough loss. I mean, like a close, devastating type loss. It gives them a chance to reset, and I think it gives them a chance also to reassess after 2 games. So I don't think they're upset about it because they have another one.
All right, I'll cede that to you in this particular instance, Kurt, because you're guest. Now. Let's get into conference action because now it just really starts to get interesting. This is where if that challenge with LSU does not pan out and they have to make some corrections on that nice open date that they have there, then they have to face Louisville on September 16th. This is a team that has a lot of potential, especially on paper. Things are coming together there. This could be a really challenging game for Florida State. What are your views on this game?
Oh, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, if you look at last year, I think that Louisville game, I want to say in 2020, the last time they went up there, was coming off their big home win over North Carolina. And everyone was like, oh, here we go. Is Mike, are they turning the corner? Is this where we're starting to see kind of the seeds of Mike Gravel grow? And they kind of got walloped up there. They gave up far too many big plays. It was not a very pretty game. It was over well before the clock hit 0. Yeah, I mean, it's whichever way LSU goes, I think plays a big role because I think a big thing for this team with what they want to accomplish in terms of win total, with what I think they can accomplish, is not losing both those games. So obviously, you are in a better spot, obviously, if you beat LSU and you're not trying to avoid falling to 1 and 2. But if they're 2-0, if they're coming off an upset, basically road win over LSU, how do they handle success? It's fascinating. I mean, Malik Cunningham, I think, is maybe still underrated, even though, I mean, it's the ACC is a great quarterback conference this year. But yeah, I'm fascinated to see how they acquit themselves in that game under the circumstances, because it's not a place I think they've lost three of their last four up there, or two of their last three, something like that. I mean, it's not been a place they've always performed well.
Yeah.
So this stretch after heading into the October 22nd bye, 3 out of 4 at home, and is really going to, I feel like, kind of make or break this season. We'll start with a much more winnable game at home against Boston College. Obviously, they have a good offense with Phil Dracovic, Zay Flowers, but going into Tallahassee, it feels like the Noles have a slight edge there to me.
I agree. I think in our podcast I did with a colleague of mine the other day, I picked that as a win mainly because FSU, they won up there last year, kind of in that strong stretch of finish season. I think it was a pretty close game that I think FSU fans would tell you shouldn't have been as close because of some penalties that they think went against them, and I think some media members thought similar. So
Yeah,
I agree with you.
Okay, so yep, Wake Forest next, and we have no idea if Sam Hartman's going to be available to play in that game. We just know he according to Dave Clawson, he'll be available at some point this year. So it's a tough way to predict this game, not knowing what Sam Hartman, if Sam Hartman will play in this game. But even still, I feel like this game at home should be a very competitive ball game.
Oh, I agree. I mean, especially if Sam Hartman plays, I do think this will be a game. If he doesn't play, it'll be interesting to see. I mean, how their quarterback situation plays itself out. No doubt. I'm obviously wishing him all the best in whatever he's going through, because that's more important than any of these games. And so, but yeah, I mean, it definitely. If we're talking the football side of it, it may be advantageous that Florida State's got him October 1st, a little over a month from now, when there are questions about Sam, and even when Sam's able to make it back, who knows what his timeline from return to practice to being able to play could be.
After that, it is at NC State, a team that is returning a ton of experience, and some people think I've seen people think they're a dark horse for the college football playoff. So this will be a tough game for them.
Yeah, I think this will be. I think this the next two stretch is definitely the hardest 2-game stretch. So LSU and Louisville in the conversation, but I think this is a harder 2-game stretch than that.
Yeah, and then that other game being Clemson at home. Again, we don't know what Clemson's offense is going to be like, if DJ Uiagalelei is still going to be the quarterback, if he plays more like 2020, or if they're back to the freshman Kate Klubnik. So hard to say.
And whoever it is, there's a lot of talent around.
Yep.
All right. Next up, another open date. How about that? Is this one coming at a good time? Yes, it is.
You may want it before Clemson or NC State, but I think you'll take it after that stretch.
Yeah, I think that's a good time. Coming up on Halloween weekend, Georgia Tech.
That's a game to me that I would say has to be a win, and I would think Florida State would hope it's not competitive. No offense to Georgia Tech. We may see a step forward this year, but I mean, I'm not sure I've seen a ton that gives me a ton of confidence in Jeff Collins this season, who's definitely on the hottest seat.
Only question is, will he still be the coach in that game?
Hey, you're right. There's a non-zero chance for sure.
Yeah, I will tell you guys, I don't see Georgia Tech getting rid of Collins during the season. I don't see it.
We'll see.
Just for a variety of really good reasons. November 5th at Miami. That is going to be. It's always a barn burner, that cross-state rivalry thing, but this year is really going to be something else.
Yeah, I'm fascinated to see what those teams are at that point. Where is Florida State? Where is Miami? I think we rightfully so. There's a lot of confidence in Tyler Van Dyke, Miami's quarterback, coming into the season, come of what he did last year when he took over the starting job. But he loses a few of those receivers. I mean, Charleston Rambo was big for him. So I'm fascinated to see, obviously, how he is without maybe some of the guys he relied on last year, how Mario Cristobal is adapting there. I think Miami fans would tell you that game's not going to be close. And I don't know. I believe Mario can absolutely have a great deal of success there. We're already seeing the recruiting success. But I look at that Miami team, and I'm not sure they're the 10-win team that I think some of them think they are. So I think it could be a game, even though it's down there.
Next up, on the road again at Syracuse.
Another one that, I mean, it's if you're really Florida State, kind of on the path back to being Florida State, it should probably be a comfortable win, even though it's on the road.
All right, the last two games, you host Louisiana. Obviously, that is not the same Louisiana team of the last couple of seasons, and they'll see the former coach the week after. So, but it feels like a win, just on paper.
I agree. I know he took a couple pieces with him from Louisiana to Florida. So,
yep, and obviously closing up on the day after Thanksgiving, in-state rival Florida, a game that they very easily could have won last year for bowl eligibility, but let it slip through at the end. But I feel hard to say what year one in down in Gainesville is going to be, but it still feels like a winnable ball game.
I think it is winnable for sure. I think I'm interested by what that Florida team looks like. Like you talked about with Napier, I think Anthony Richardson, their quarterback, is quite talented, but I think he's also fairly raw. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays itself out.
Go Noles. Subscribe to ACC Nation on your favorite podcast and streaming radio platforms. Plus, be sure to like and subscribe to ACC Nation on YouTube. Thanks to listeners and viewers worldwide. We appreciate your comments on our videos. You keep entertaining us. Hey, we'll keep entertaining you. Thanks to our special guest, Kurt Weiler of the Osceola on the Rivals Network. If you're looking for the latest on the Seminoles, be sure to follow him on Twitter and be sure to subscribe to the Osceola at floridastate.rivals.com. Thank you, Kurt. Appreciate you being here.
Thanks, Kurt.
Always a pleasure, guys. Appreciate it.